Episode 97 of the Church Digital Podcast, powered once again by Stadia Church Planning. Jeff here, 97. Episode 100 is just around the corner, and it's going to be a doozy. I'm not even going to tell you about all the stuff we've got coming up in episode 100. I'm just going to tell you, you want to stay tuned. It's going to be an incredible episode. We got enough excitement to talk about today. We don't even need to get into what episode 100 is going to look like coming very soon. Because here's where we are with episode 97. Hey, you know what? I don't even get into episode 97 yet. There's something really cool before we even get there. The Church Digital here. With this podcast, the Church Digital Podcast, we do a lot of deep, heady interviews, ask a lot of questions, talk a lot about future stuff, philosophical. Yeah, I mean, that's just kind of my groove. That's where I like to ride. And so we do a lot of that here on the podcast. But I hear you listening audience. Hey, Jeff, can any of this be practical? Hey, Jeff, I love where you're going, but that's not where we are today. Can you help me where we are today? And so we're doing something new. We're betaing something new. We're trying something out. We're firing that BB before a bullet, before we get to the cannonball, because we want to see what it looks like for us to do something a little more practical here at the Church Digital. So we are launching a new show, and it's going to be called Beta, because why not? We're experimenting with something, and we want to help churches like you learn how to experiment, learn how to iterate. We want to answer the questions that you're asking right now in this season today and give you practical steps, practical guidance, practical solutions to help your church not get stuck in this COVID season. We'll talk philosophical in the podcast, but in this new show, Beta, we want to answer your questions. And I mean that quite literally. I want you to tell me your questions. So here's what we're doing. Go to, and you know what? It's not even a website. That's funny. I just automatically went into that. I want you to text me. Here's what I've got. The number is 484-324-8724. Now, if you speak phone alphabet, that's literally number 4, the church. Yes, my phone number is number 4, the church. Thank God for Google Voice, because I have no idea how I got that number. Google Voice helped me get it. Number 4, the church, 484-324-8724. Text me your questions. Where are you stuck as a church? What are you wrestling with? What are the questions leadership's asking of you that you don't know the answer? What are the questions you're asking leadership and leadership's giving you just the blank stare trying to figure out where you are? What questions, what struggles, what issues, what challenges are you, the church, facing in this maybe post-COVID season that we're in? Where are you at? I want to help you. And so we're doing a weekly show. It's going to roll out on Wednesday nights at thechurch.digital. We're going to roll it out on social media. Podcast is going to launch on Thursday with it, called thechurch.digital beta. More information on it soon. Check social media on that. But we're going to launch this thing literally on Wednesday. So just in a mere couple days from when this episode launches, you will see beta happening in real time on Thursday, October 1st, and Wednesday, September 31st on social media. So check it out there, thechurch.digital beta. I told you I'm excited. That was a long talk about beta. But let's move on here to episode 97. So we're going back to the buildings. We're starting to get back into this groove. We're now wrestling with, oh my gosh, how do we be physical and digital? How do we be super creative in executing the physical environment when we've been pouring all those physical resources into the digital to make it excellent? But now the resources are going back to physical. How do I still do excellence digitally? Why should I even do excellence digitally? Is there a reason behind me doing a digital exclusive, a digital service, or should we focus that online? Is there a way that the two can work together? These are really the questions that we wrestled with here at the Church Digital Podcast, here in episode 97, having a conversation with Craig Dockery. Now, Craig is like the weekend experience guy for the church. He's the lead creative, responsible for the physical as well as the digital types of environments there for Crossroads. Crossroads, by the way, we'll put a link in the show notes. If you've not watched their online services, arguably, at this point, I would say it's one of the most, if not the most creative service that's executed here online. I'm not saying I talk about this in the podcast, and it still blows my mind. This example, I'm literally watching their lead pastor Brian Tome preach a sermon while wakeboarding behind a boat. Like the camera's following him. You can see the boom mic on the boat trying to get the audio. It's just crazy, some of the creative aspects they're putting in. But more than just some of these crazy aspects, man, they're really rethinking the liturgy, the flow, the execution of this. Do we need to have a 30-minute sermon, or is it better to have 4 7-minute sermons? Well, let's ask that question and figure it out. And so like you're really starting to see Crossroads start to pull the thread on some really interesting conversations about what a creative service looks like. So let's listen to this. Let's dive in. Churches, like first and foremost, like Crossroads has a ton of resources, and it's very easy to listen to this conversation and get church lust to think, oh my gosh, I wish I had that. Oh my gosh, I wish I had this time, those resources, that finance, that budget, that red camera, whatever it is. Like, don't get lost in that world, church. Get lost in this idea of intentionality and rethinking what digital looks like, and how what we're doing digitally cannot just exist in the digital space, but how it can coexist in physical, and how the digital service can maybe make our physical service better. That's the win to this conversation. And so I'm bringing in, once again, Craig Dockery from Crossroads. I'm bringing in Ray Diarmas, digital pastor from Christ Fellowship Miami, co-host once again, myself, Jeff with theChurch.digital and Stadia Church Planning, in a conversation that I'm calling Crossroads Creative Online Services. Okay, everybody, here you go. Well, hey, even just to kind of open it up here a little bit, Tell us your ministry story, how you ended up at Crossroads, how you ended up in the role that you're in. What does that path look like for you?
Well, I'll try and give you the short version, but it started with me being in elementary school, being the kid who could draw and play piano. I played in bands and also did graphic design for the first part of my career, and worked at different design agencies and kind of business consulting kind of groups, and in between doing little tours with bands and all that. And my 20s were pretty dead spiritually, and I found my way to Crossroads and just sat in the back because I was frustrated and everything with just the church, and kind of healed there for a couple of years, and then started volunteering on the weekends playing music. And then I started to meet these friends who were super talented and kind and loved Jesus, and was like, I didn't even know these people existed, And then one thing led to another. I keep meeting folks, and I would go on like mission trips and volunteer at events and do things like that. And then next thing you know, my buddy Matt, my friend now Matt, said, "Would you ever want to work at Crossroads?" And I was like, "No," And then like 6 months later, I couldn't get it out of my head, and I said, "Yeah, okay, I'll do it." And so that was almost 10 years ago. And I started off more on like the design communication side of things, and I've slowly kind of flowed over to the experience side of what we do.
Awesome. And so, like, just specifically, tell me about your role. Yeah. What are you currently doing in context of Crossroads? So
I currently lead kind of our centralized creative team, which consists of a video team, a music and worship team, or two teams, and then creative directors and producers. So we have a team of those that will work hand in hand to lead every project. And then we still interface a ton. We work a lot with the sites and the folks that support that, and our marketing team and the folks who do the branding and series brands and all that kind of thing.
So it's a lot of weekend service related content.
Yeah.
Stuff even beyond that. Like what specifics? Like some practical. What are the things that you're doing?
The kinds of work that we would do, that the folks on my team would do, are basically all of the online weekend stuff. Oversee whatever a series brand or creative direction for any of that would be. Under the music team, we have all of our Crossroads music, which is just a Spotify artist or whatever that we're promoting, doing a ton of songwriting and putting building up that whole thing, and then we'll help out on all different kinds of things like that. Will spread out to sites whenever there's services at sites, and we do some ministry support. But as we've grown, most of the ministry support would come through a weekend experience where it's like, oh, you guys have a thing coming up. We'll make an ad for it and put it in here and do it in there. But basically, the vast majority of our work is making the weekend happen.
Yeah, I've been so impressed with Crossroads in the season, watching it. I don't not on a regular basis, not on a weekly basis, but one of those churches I'll just kind of flip around and be like, hey, let me check out the service, let me see what's happening, and the creative resources that are getting put into these services, the unique approach that you guys are doing in creating these services are really phenomenal. Like just the different spin, the approach to not looking, the average church service in this COVID season, forgive me, churches that are out there, it's the physical church model that's done online. Yeah, maybe some of the churches are literally recording like the worship and the teaching on stage. And if you're doing that, that's great. Or you're kind of taking that model and you're doing things in a living room or a different thing, but you're still kind of like following that same template, that same mold of what church is. And it feels like with you guys, man, you've really kind of flipped the script here and have taken a much different approach to how your online services go. Like maybe speak a little bit to that. Like what has that process been for you in discovery of how to do a unique approach to a digital service?
It's been a really long process, I would say. So this started all the way back in 2014 with us saying, what if we did like video teaching for Easter, and 2014, that was great. And we went to Brian, our senior pastor, he taught in a barn and a junkyard and in a room full of lanterns or something like that, and it's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's a different take on things. And then in 2015, we went over and we did Easter in Israel. And so we spent a whole week filming there, filming a band on location and all that. And it just grew and grew and grew until in 2018, we said, we're going to try and do 20 weekends that are screen first, because we were seeing the same trend of people are consuming church in a different way. For the kind of church, the big attractional kind of ginormo church that we are, it used to be trying to get people to come and sit in the back row. Well, the new back row is the website or the screen or the Apple TV app or whatever it is, So thinking about if we're trying to reach new people, the place they get introduced to us is digitally. And so let's start there. And, it kind of came down to the insight of people don't just like to watch cooking shows anymore. They watch Chef's Table, that it just, the chef is in this amazing immersive environment. Or even you go back to the 90s and people consume Jerry Seinfeld, not just on a stage, but through his show that just, embraces the medium that, where people are, and so that's what we started doing. And so we've had a bunch of wins and some failures and all this, but like we've learned a lot along the way, to the point that when we went digital first, or digital only, online only, in I guess it was like early March this year, we'd done 30 of these already, so we already had some reps, and we're like, well, okay, now how do we do it? What if we had to do this every week? And so we quickly made some pivots, but we had enough in our back pocket and ways that we had, we'd learned some stuff already. So it was great.
It's good. And so, obviously COVID hits, everybody makes a shift. Early on, a lot of us paid the dumb tax and some different stuff. What were some things that you saw when you made that transition? Even though you had already kind of dabbled in this stuff, what were some things that you saw early on were going to be some challenges, I guess you could say, because most churches aren't even close to where you guys even were back then?
I think it had as much to do with how do we make a cohesive experience. So, a lot of times when you're filming a piece at a time, and then you glue it all together. And one of the things that we had to learn pretty early on was we need to add these host segments that like connect people from the beginning to the end, and then figure out, well, where do you put, does worship go up front or at the end, or does their offering, like how does all that go? And so we started having to go back and we'd do more reshoots, to try and figure out how do we make this thing flow from beginning to end. And then we even have figured out, with all these different locations, like we might shoot worship here and teaching here and the host segment here. And then there's another little ad that we make for a thing coming up. How do we visually tie that all together? And so we've had a lot of bouncing back and forth, and that's just the beginning of it, let alone how to make teaching compelling, so.
That element there on the teaching, like what were some things that you found there to make it that much more compelling for an online environment?
Well, we're still learning how to do it, because we're continuing to do this every week. And, one of the hallmarks of our culture, I think, is that we never put it on autopilot. We just, I don't know, it's just a bunch of people that are wired not to do that, And so we're always pushing like, what can we do to make it better? How can we make it different? And it's funny, some of this stuff just comes down to process as well as what's the great big creative idea. So, we just filmed yesterday and the teaching for the first week in October. And our senior pastor, Brian, had been feeling a lot of frustration about like, we started off like filming in scenes, like we would do 3 or 4 chunks of things. And for a teacher to try and get continuity with that, it's just hard. So we would always have a director and a content person to be like just more brains to make sure that this point's getting made, or man, you were shouting the whole time, or, because they don't get that natural rise and fall of what a teaching is. And so with this last one, what we did yesterday, we did way more like a single take, and we adjusted the way that we approached the creative for that. And like went back, and he's telling a story about being in a hospital waiting room, and we filmed it in a place that looks almost like a hospital waiting room because actually getting in one to film is impossible right now. But, we would still creatively like fill his narrative with some slow-mo B-roll of him kind of reenacting, like listening to music as he's worshiping, as he's waiting for, the diagnosis or whatever. So still finding creative ways to tell it, but trying to get to like, it's kind of like teaching it. It's like like for an actor, this is the whole switch from like plays to film, right? So an actor a stage actor has to act a totally different way. It's like the whole body acts, right? And then on film, it's just like the face that acts, And so you have to learn all these new things, and you learn versus like, how do you do the whole play versus how do you get the scene exactly right? And there's a lot of trust that has to happen from the director or whoever that has the big picture, So anyway, we're dancing with all that stuff and trying to figure that out. And we have 4 teachers each that will teach the weekends to different varying degrees. And some teach really great in the chopped up ones. And Brian is like, you just got to let me I got to burn for something, and you got to let me get moving on it. And so we're constantly tweaking how to do all that stuff. But I think it's kind of the analog of from the stage to the screen back, which we did like the turn of last century. People have done this before, and it's hard. It's difficult. Some people are better at one than the other,
Yeah, I was recently talking with a church that was wrestling with some of this digital first mentality, and the thing, like even the video producer with this church was wrestling with and he was the guy who was actually quoting like the liturgy and the way that the church services is done, doing it digitally, like represented on the stage, and not really seeing the opportunity to think outside of it, and really the illustration that kind of got him to shift was actually like back in the day in the early 20s, like how they were making films 100 years ago.
Yeah.
They were filming these stage performances.
Totally.
And as it shifted, it moved away from filming a stage performance and then it went to, hey, let's film a film, get the shots that are necessary for that and edit it together. And it was funny, like even just watching his brain start to shift away from an old way of thinking to a new way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And over the course of like an hour-long conversation, he's like, that's it. Yeah. I'm sold. This is it. It makes total sense because it's just a natural progression of how we're moving away from just a stage expression to this more creative, more engaging conversation. And it's engaging, by the way. Yeah. Like I was watching one of your services and I'm watching your lead pastor, Brian, preach while he's on a wakeboard. Like he's in a bathing suit, wearing a life jacket on a boat. Yeah. And I'm like, hey, this is kind of cool. This is setting the stage well. And he goes over and picks up the wakeboard. And I'm like, hey, what? He's still preaching. Why has he got that wakeboard? Is that like a prop later on? A couple minutes later, he's literally getting drugged behind a boat. I'm seeing a boom mic kind of in the shot as you're trying to get the audio, but I'm watching him preach. Like I keep looking down at his feet. I'm wondering if his script's at his feet or if he's just trying to get comfortable on the wakeboard. But he's preaching the sermon while getting drugged behind a boat at X number of miles per hour. Yeah, I mean that's crazy, and it's engaging to a digital audience.
Sometimes it starts really strategically, like this is the topic we need to hit, and therefore, what's the thing that's actually going to do it? And And then other times it's like, well, we're talking about adventure. What sounds awesome, and Brian, that's Brian's boat and his wakeboard and all that kind of stuff. So, and I mean, that's one of the things that he's into. He's like, oh, I could totally preach doing that. And we're like, heck yeah, you could. That'd be awesome. So then we wrap the whole thing around it. And if you watch the whole thing, though, what's interesting is it's a series on adventure, which is, we believe that faith is the adventurous life. And that doesn't mean the easy life or you're always just aiming for the mountaintops, but an adventure is like saying yes to the hard thing that's in front of you. And we use the wake surfing as, at first we started, it was like, that'll be sweet, but where do we fit it in? Because then you have to have the watch out of, well, there's a bunch of people that are like, well, yeah, that's the stereotypical adventure, but that's not what we're talking about. And so we had to set it up as, this is what people think of it as adventure. But then if you watch to the very end, then it's really like the real adventure that you have is at this dinner table with your spouse, having a conversation about how you're going to keep your marriage together, or how you're going to get out of debt, or, what you really believe about God, or all those kinds of things. And so it's, I don't know, it's funny, like the stuff just keeps flowing. Early on we said, what happens if we run out of ideas? And I'm like, listen, guys, the Holy Spirit's the best creative director out there. And I got to trust that he wants us to come up with more stuff, So we just got to take one idea at a time and all that. And it's just, the ideas come from all over the place. I'd say if there's one contributing factor besides the Holy Spirit being a great creative director, is we have a great team and we do everything in team. That's why I wanted to have my colleague Paula on there, but she's on a shoot. There's this 1975 Volkswagen minibus that we're filming for the next thing, and it died, and she's at AutoZone trying to figure out if it's the battery or something more sinister, so she couldn't be here. But everything we do, there's never a lone wolf or the single mad genius. It's like everything gets run through this whole team of really talented people that are really trusting of each other too. So even more than the talent is the trust, I think, is the key.
Yeah, I'm just curious, even setting the stage here. Describe like that team, staff, volunteers. We've got varying churches, big churches, small churches, but having that creative team as opposed to one person kind of driving vision down, but having that team approach. I'm just curious, like describe that team. Who's got a seat at the table? And
we have so it's a decently sized team. So what I would say is don't listen to the sheer head count, but think about the roles that are involved, right? So there's the teacher. And we have a whole content team that kind of lays out, assists the teachers in saying, these are the topics. And there's a handful of folks on this team that kind of say, what do we think God's saying to our church? What do we want to do? So there's always just on a shoot, there's a content rep who's saying, these are the points you got to hit. They're walking along. We've kind of graduated to using teleprompters way more often. So they're managing that and managing the script to say, like, these are the bullet points or whatever. And then there's the director, and so there's like 2 or 3 people that can be a content person. And then there's about 4 of us that can be directors. And so we're making sure from it looks right. The whole story kind of pulls together, a lot of times a director would kind of be content and directing, in a regular film or whatever, but just because of the teaching and because it's like every week and there's always a new idea, it's great to have a brain just focused on that. So it's, tying together the emotional, like the performance, so to speak, of the teacher. Like, how are you emotively, teaching and expressing yourself here? And then we have a whole production crew that will typically be 1 or 2 camera guys. And then if there's 2 camera guys, then there will be a director of photography that's making sure everything is working. And they also kind of work with lighting and all that. So they'll be rigging up lights and doing all kinds of stuff. Then there's an audio guy doing there. And usually there's like and those are all, everyone there so far is typically staff. Occasionally we have some like really talented creatives that will step in and direct, on a high-powered volunteer thing, or we might contract them occasionally. And then we usually have a grip or 2 that's just lugging around stuff. Like one of the big things is you just don't have time. So on a video shoot, time is of the essence. It's like a game, right? It's like a football game. So there's only so much time to get it done. So you do all the prep before, you can do all the debriefs after, but the more hands you have, the better. So there will be a couple grips there. And in the best cases, we have a makeup person. We always forget it because it's just a bunch of like scraggly looking guys making this thing. And then Brian, our teacher, main teacher's like, how do I look? And I'm like, fine. And he's like, we need another set of opinion. You look like yourself, whatever. So we have that. So that's usually kind of the bare bones crew. And then there will be a day of producer for the video team who's just making sure that like everything runs according to schedule. Like all the stuff, all the props are on the set, we're getting fed, all of that kind of thing. And so that's kind of the core crew. And then ahead of that, the creative director or the director and the content person and the teacher and the overall experience producer for the whole series will work together and kind of come up with a plan, work through that with the video team. Then we have the shoot. And then there's a team of editors. That's usually there's like one editor that pulls it together with the help of a couple others because it's the weekend teaching. And then we also have the worship stuff and we're kind of running that parallel concurrently. So that's a whole different setup. It's actually a lot more people because we have more cameras at once that we're filming with.
How far out are you guys? Just because, all this storyboarding and just kind of thinking through the visuals and connecting visuals and all that stuff, I can only imagine it's a lot. I'd heard you mention earlier that you guys already filmed October, which, for those of you listening, like we're kind of 2 weeks out from that. So at the time of this recording. So what are you thinking in terms of, hey, not just ideally, but on the norm? We're normally right here.
For a creative, there's nothing like a deadline to actually get work done, So the real deadline that we had when we went into lockdown in March was we started putting stuff on TV. And that all had an episode or a service. We just call them episodes because they're more like, they could be spiritual episodes, right? So an episode had to be done by the Wednesday before it was shown on that Sunday. And so we were in a bunch of different local markets where I've actually switched our TV strategy a little bit. We're going to be on TBN for ongoing or whatever. But for a long, and that's a whole other way of thinking. But if we had to be done with everything the Wednesday before, then that meant our first review of the video was the like 2 Wednesdays before, which meant we needed another week to edit it from shooting. And so what it came down to is it takes about a month of time to put the whole thing together. So we're thinking you're concepting 4 weeks out, filming 3 weeks out, editing 2 weeks out, and then finishing and posting the week of. And it was hard to get to that place. And we're finally in a rhythm where it's still tough because it's just a huge amount of work, but we have the expectations set, now.
Of all the creative ideas that kind of you generated, at this point, 4 weeks out, like if you're executing at that, like you don't have a lot of buffer or variance for, well, that's not gonna work. Let's iterate and do another thing. So there's a lot of pressure, TBN, television, broadcasts as well. It's getting more and more complex for you. How do you know if an idea is gonna work?
You never do. You never know if it's gonna work. Because it's so many things coming together. It's just, it's the idea that just talking about the medium, video is the most collaborative art form. So you got to get the right performance. You got to get the camera done well. If you're trying to be funny, it actually has to be funny, and the timing has to be right. And the whole thing has to come together. And you just never know. But it's that old adage, like the harder you work, the luckier you get. So the more reps you get on something, the more likely you are to hit it every now and again, So, yeah, you never know if it's going to work. And a lot of times, I think one of the hardest things for us is we get an idea for something like, oh, that'd be cool. Like two locations that we really struggled with. Three. One was, we're talking about God as judge. Well, what's the sweetest place to do that? In a courtroom. Great. Oh, well, it's COVID. They're all closed. And then like the day before the shoot, you just start praying. And it's funny. I think God cares about video locations, and a place opened up, right? We're just trying to do the waiting room, and we barely got into that, just in time. We just filmed. We film all of our music sets for an entire series at one time, and we were in this giant airplane hangar that we were able to get a hold of, where the guy was like, well, if it rains, I'm gonna have to move the planes in. And we're like, that's where we're gonna be. And so it was just all sketchy. It was like, I hope it doesn't rain Tuesday and Wednesday because we're loading in and doing all this stuff. And so it really, I don't know. I think that it's kind of like there's no atheist in a foxhole. There's no atheist on a video shoot, just because there's so many factors that you just don't have control over,
What's been the craziest idea you guys have come up with that's like, no, that's too crazy? What's like you had somebody preaching, Brian's preaching while he's wakeboarding. That to me, it's crazy. Tell me the thing that you're like, no, we're going to bank that one. We'll do that.
I don't know. I think some of it comes down to, it's not crazy if everybody's excited about it, So it's really less about how aggressive is it? And it's more like, is everybody can we get everybody pumped about this? Because, the video guys they work a ton of time and they're super creative, but also super technical. And like, how are we going to rig the lighting up to make this whole thing work? Or how are we going to make it so you can actually hear the guy or whatever? But if they're pumped about the concept as much as you are, and if the teacher is, then they'll do anything. One thing we tried to do that didn't work, well, we pitched it. We were trying to get Chuck, one of our other teachers, to teach like upside down for like 5 minutes and like have the camera upside down. And then it's like you turn the camera and you're like, oh, he's been upside down the whole time. It's this like old Penn and Teller SNL skit from the 80s that's really great. And like it took us like 4 days. Like he wouldn't email us back. And then he's finally like, I don't want to do that. So, you just got to keep pushing, and whatever works.
So like what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing, and by the way, you said this earlier, but there's all sorts of links in the show notes to services and some of the things they're doing as a team. So if you're listening on audio, on podcast, you need to go like click over and kind of check the way that this church operates in their services. They're thinking outside of the box. How'd you get there? Like even the idea of, the guy said no to hanging upside down like a bat. Okay, that's pretty radical. I've seen a lot of radical things that have been accepted. So, like, what's the DNA journey, the path? You've been involved with the church for a while, it seems. So, how did this environment come in place? You don't see this in a lot of churches.
Well, I think some of it is a bunch of people that are just really wired to push themselves, right? Like I was saying, and get bored with doing the same thing over and over again. And it's a dynamic, like our leadership is the same kind of thing where they're more aggressive than we are in a lot of cases. Like, I don't know, a lot of times I've presented an idea to a group of the leadership or the board at our church, and they're like, cool, here's 4 times that. Now go make it better and like get 4 times the return, So we really have a culture of entrepreneurship and moving, trying new things. And it's just an awareness of like, it's not just because of, I don't know, because it sounds fun or that would be neat. It's because the general church is in decline, and church work is like, it's just harder than, I've worked outside, like in agencies and all that kind of thing, for half of my career. And it's just harder inside because the church is in decline. Less and less people are just even open to it. And so if you really believe that this is what we're called to do, and that this is, people are separated from God and they need to know God, then wouldn't you do everything you possibly could to do it? And so that's the kind of mindset that we have, where it's, it's just a video shoot, but man, someone could meet Jesus this weekend because of that. And it's a little harder every week just because culture is shifting the exact other way, or political sentiment or any of that kind of stuff. It's just, so we're like salmon swimming against the tide, and so anyway, there's already that recognized that they already recognize that, right? But then it's still a huge process. You've talked with Matt Welty and him talking about all the digital products and the stuff we make, I'm sure, talking about the app and all that kind of thing. And that's been a 5-6 year journey as well, So it starts with like little nuggets. And I appreciate the pushback that leadership has initially, because it's like they have a lot at stake. They have a lot of people they're caring for, and as well as like limited resources to do it. Like everything that we're doing looks kind of like a big deal, but we're always just trying to squeeze the most we can out of it. If we have a $10,000 budget, let's make it look like it's a $30,000 budget, right? So we're always pushing, always trying to do that, and scarce resources, no matter where you are. And I appreciate them pushing back. So it's just been taking time to like build trust and get little wins. Like that's why I said like, it's like our 35th episode that we jumped into at the beginning of COVID, because we had some reps, and it wasn't like, guys, what if we did this crazy thing? It's like, hey, remember the thing we've been doing? What if we just kept doing that? So everything is an incremental step. Like the version of the app that Matt is working on is like version 50 of it. I don't know, and so it just keeps getting better and better. There's no such thing as the overnight success. I remember seeing some artist win Grammy of the Year, or like Best New Artist for Best New Artist Grammy for her 7th album or something like that. And that's just kind of how it works. You just got to keep plugging away.
So kind of take us into the nuggets that you're kind of thinking through as far as like what's next. And you don't have to give us like the full painted future, but there's obviously some things in the hopper that you're like, all right, this is where we're going next based off of what we've seen in this season, because reopening will happen, all sorts of things. And so I can only imagine just kind of what's baking in there coming up.
Yeah, well, a couple of the things on our minds, reopening is definitely one. So October 4th, we are going to go back to a limited reopening with some of our sites. And so there's big implications with that. We've been pulling site resources to do the extra work that we've been doing. And so it's not all just like what's going to happen, but it's more like logistically what can happen, And so, we're thinking now about still creating the online experience that we do. And rather than going what we used to do is we were a physical church that had an online presence. And now it's really thinking more like we make online experiences and then also have live expressions of that. So, we make the online one first because of the timeline for it, And so thinking about when we come back, we're going to obviously the same content online and live, but really splitting the teams more and splitting the kinds of experiences, even though you would hopefully get the same biblical truth out of it, maybe even sing one of the same songs or something, but it's got to be an experience that's made for that environment, which actually is really great. It's more work, but it's freeing, I mean, I was looking, some of the questions you guys were asking up front, like, how do you even get started with this? And I think the key is, it's so simple. It's stupid simple. The key is always like, who's your audience and what's your objective? And the more specific you can get with both of those, the more chance you have of succeeding, right? So if you, and then when you have 2 audiences and 2 objectives, then suddenly you're trying to make this like, I don't know, like some amphibious car that's just a crappy boat and a crappy car, And so getting the clarity right now that we have of like, we are making a digital thing and we are making a live thing. And they both have a really strong suits in these areas, and let's hit those versus trying to make something that works for everybody.
Yeah, you just said something I wasn't aware of. So let's back up and we'll get back to that. You guys were kind of clear. You're one of the front runners back in, I don't know, June, July, August. North Point announced, hey, we're done for 2020. Pick it up in 2021, see how it's at. You guys kind of like the next week, as I recall, hey, we're done for 2020 as well. Yeah. And so now, I don't want to say you're backtracking because it's 2020. You're allowed to experiment.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many churches have said something and then had to take it back.
Yeah.
Like, walk me through some of the mentality, because a lot of churches were like, they're not doing anything, but you guys are starting to meet. So like, what's the framework, the mental mindset with where you guys are?
I think the mental mindset is our main goal is to minister to people, and there are more and more people that are just hurting for their church. And I know that a weekend service is not the full expression of church, but that's a cadence in a year that has lost all cadence that they miss. And so thinking about how can we help them, how can we, one of the things we talk about is when Sunday comes, we get to be water to people. They're dry their whole week. It just sucks. The random guy, his marriage is in trouble. His kids hate him. He doesn't like his job. Like, he's just gotten the crap beat out of him all week. We get to like be this guide to the Holy Spirit and to Jesus and like God the Father of like that he's not going to get anywhere else. Like, that's amazing. That's wonderful. So getting to be water, the more water we can be, the better, And I mean, even to that point, you were talking about, I was talking about cadence, that's one of the tough things about the digital thing is that I don't know, today is just day. I don't know what day even is it, you know? So we've struggled to like push, like promote the weekends and do all that because I think people's rhythms have started to fall off a little bit. And so just like I said, like church work is always hard. It's just like, everything's fallen away. Like, and you gotta put extra effort to help maintain it, you know? And so that's one of the things we've had to do is like figure out new ways to promote it, whether it's on our social or whatever. Just remind people like stay in the cadence. You know, this is good. This is a great thing. But anyway, that's ministering to people. That's mainly the reason.
So you've got this wrestle of thinking screen first, digital first is some of the language we've used on the podcast, continuing that. And now you're feeling, or you will be feeling, the pain point of, oh man, I got to do a live as well as a digital, where if you're like the typical church right now in America that is meeting, 30% of the people are coming back to the building, seems to be the average. Yeah. 70% are not engaging physically. They're still digital for whatever reason, if they're still engaged, or maybe we as the church, we've lost them. It's hard to tell, statistically speaking, right now. But I'm just curious, like, you know, I'm watching a service right now, kind of in the screen going on the side. I'm watching Brian, lead pastor, walking around what it seems to be like a high school football locker room, and he's doing that expression. He's actually doing communion right now. That's in a very old kind of chapel church. There's stained glass in there. And so you've created these beautiful digital expressions. Now, how much of those digital expressions are going to be seen in the physical location? Like what's the balance? Is it entirely live and you're creating two completely separate experiences? Is there any bleed over? Kind of what's the relationship between the live and the physical, at least where you think you're going to be here in October?
Well, we talked about that and kind of came up with 4 options. There's the 2 extremes that are play the video in the room. Great. It's fine. Or have the guy teach live or the woman teach live. And then there's a couple different hybrids. One that could be play the video, but have the site pastor, the campus pastor, introduce it or add their tag on the end or personalize it in some way. So there's still a live only in this room kind of thing that you get. And then another one would be have the teacher teach live, but use any portion that you're like, oh man, you're not going to get that on a stage, you know, and show that. Like, for example, the wake surfing, right? So like maybe show that as the intro. You could even put that in a different spot in the service as like a teaser into the rest of the teaching. So we debated all this stuff and like, you know, we got these options. Let's try it a different way each week and play with it. And so that's really where we're going is just continuing to experiment with it and see what works and how people respond to it, you know? So
speaking of the fact that I'm watching a service in real time, I wanted to ask this, and I've seen it before, but why do you put the capo guitar patterns on the screen? Is the goal during worship, is the goal for people to like play along at home, and so you're incorporating kind of a physical as well as video worship experience? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I don't think we've 100% cracked the code on what does online worship music look like. I think we're doing as well as anybody is out there. It's not so much that we're not doing everything that we can. It's just, I think it as much has to do with the fact that culture never sings. You know, you might sing at a concert, you might sing at church, but historically humanity sings together. You go to a bar and you sing, or the pub or whatever, or you sing before battle, and we just don't have that. So people aren't conditioned to sit in front of a TV and watch it. So trying to do everything that we can to engage people and, you know, give them a reason to pick up their guitar, because that can be a whole, you know, that could be, I know me personally being a musician, I connect musically in a whole different way if I have a piano or a guitar or something with me. And so I think it also takes a little bit more out of performance-y mode, which can be the downfall of a lot of modern worship stuff. Even if it's well-intentioned, people just look at it and they're like, oh, those guys look like rock stars or whatever. So the more we can indicate, like, this is meant to be a communal thing, like, let's all do this together, the better.
Yeah, I love that. I've never thought of it, but even as you're doing micro locations, this house church, and you're trying to incorporate live environments along with the digital and create, we use the term Phygital a lot here on the podcast, physical plus digital, combining of it. like, creating that expression, that environment is beautiful. Have you guys toyed with creatively? Biblically, musical worship is just one method of worship. Have you toyed with? Do you kind of pull the thread and explore, some of the others? Maybe what is that other methods of creative worship, quote unquote? What does that look like for Crossroads?
You mean like sacrificing a goat or whatever, or what exactly are you thinking about?
Spoken word testimonies,
sure.
prayer moments.
Yeah.
Sure, if you got a good goat story, I'm willing, but there's plenty of other references other than the goat.
There might be some blowback for that. So one of the things that we're constantly adjusting with the service mix or the service, the liturgy, you might say, is what are the elements that we put into it? And the big limit that we had early on was that we were first making it for TV because that was the hardest constraint. So we had 28 minutes and 30 seconds to get in and get out. And so that we had to cut stuff. And then we had a longer online version. But now that we've kind of flipped it and we say our online version, the thing on Crossroads.net, the thing on all our Apple TV app, or on the phone app or any of that stuff is what we have now. We have about 45 minutes. And so that gives us more space, and you'll start to see trickling in over the next month or so back to the stuff that we've done before, like stories or like a performance song, or more like a like a immersive prayer moment that we might do. And we like I said, we haven't fully figured out the medium, but we're just taking continual steps in that way. One of the things we did, like imaginative prayer. I don't know if you guys have ever done any of that kind of thing. You imagine that God's in the room, or you're talking to Jesus and do all that. We did that during one of the weeks of the series way back, like in April. And so we've incorporated some of that stuff, but we've been kind of bare bones worship and teaching with that time constraint. And so now we're starting to expand it a little bit more, but definitely more stories, more. And another thing I'd say about worship is it's, it can be expressed by, I think if there's a defining thing about Crossroads, even more than just kind of creativity about, within the orthodoxy of this is a Jesus believing church, what's the unique thing about it is our ability to mobilize, And so when we do these recap videos of this group of people that made 3,000 masks in a day, or, us going and serving the hospital staff, in the midst of the very beginning of lockdown, or, us serving cops and protesters in the midst of some of the things going on around here. That's as much worship as anything, and that stuff's really beautiful. And it's like boots on the ground worship, So we always like that being a component of what we present a Crossroads weekend to look like.
One of the things that I love all of that, by the way, it was beautiful and not a goat story to be heard. So we're heading in the right direction.
Not yet, but maybe you asked what's too crazy of a story?
Evidently
check back with me. Yeah.
There's something baking there. We'll have to come back to it. I'll email you when I come up with something. We'll experiment with you. Hey, like one of the things that the services that I've seen, they seem to be very focused on, and I hesitate to use the word call to action, because I don't want to make this a marketing thing, but they seem to be focused towards driving people to a place. Like I've seen, vision videos kind of at the beginning of the service. You're positioning teaching. For the most part, it seems to be teachings more up at the front, worship on the backside. Mm-hmm. And even with the teaching, there seems to be like a focused towards the teaching that follows with a connect to the guides to get connected into the discipleship. There's intentionality with how you are crafting the services, where all the things seem to drive towards that call to action, where you're trying to get people to take next steps.
Yeah.
Is that come intentional? Is it intentional, where like that's the beginning of the conversation, or is the service crafted and kind of the call to action is the last step? Okay, what can we kind of squeeze in here? Maybe talk about that level of crafting leading towards the call to action.
Yeah, it depends on the week and it depends on the time of year. We put a rough schedule together for the whole year to say we know that in January or February, and then once again in September and October, those are our group seasons, and understanding that getting in community is a first step towards true discipleship, and in a big church where it's really easy just to sit and watch the stream or sit in the back row or whatever, what's the next step? And so that's where a lot of that stuff starts to come in. And occasionally there might be something like a challenge for giving, or, like we have a 90-day tithe testing that we do. That's, 90 days of God blessing your life or your money back kind of thing. And it's actually worked out really well as we teach the principle of tithing, and so sometimes we need to make sure that we're getting people to like sign up for a group or sign up for the journey or sign up for a guide. And most of the time that stuff is purely for their benefit, purely for the sake of their growth. Well, I guess it always should be, occasionally there's like, well, we're trying to hit a strategic thing or whatever, but it's always to help people. And a lot of times with like additional burden to us, the more they do. Like the guide thing, you mentioned the whole spiritual outfitter idea. We recently went through this whole rebrand exercise where we just thought, like, how can we reframe who Crossroads is, what we are, what we do? And that's where the spiritual outfitter came from. And one of the big components about that is the concept of guides, which is, it's not necessarily like a full-on discipling relationship, but it's just the idea that at a big church, it's easy to be like, where do I even begin? And so we thought the easiest way is just to connect people with actual humans who can be like, how are you doing? Let's check in every month. And I have a general idea of what's going on here, so I can show you kind of, these are the tools that we have in our tool belt for you to grow closer to God. And so, that's the kind of thing. It's like the more people who do guides, the more work it is for us, but it's good.
Yeah.
But so when we're not doing those, I just think, like I said, mobilization, we have a bent towards like, cool, nice service. What does it mean on Tuesday for you? Like get people to actually put their faith into action. And so some of that's just in the DNA of always trying to have some call to action, no matter what it is, to put your faith into action or test it.
I love that. And we're going to be kind of scratching the surface. The guides that you guys, I've heard Greg Dockery in separate conversations gone into great detail. Greg's been on the podcast here as well. Recent, I don't know how recently, maybe within the past, in the COVID season, it was on talking about some things. And we're actually going to have Joey Santos, who's up in your area, our Christ Church over in Mason, Ohio.
Okay,
is going to be there doing some interesting things on the guides, and so a similar concept to what you guys are doing with the guides. So we'll dig more into that in a future podcast. But I'm curious with this, even just as we're landing the plane here, tips, tricks. Hey, like there are advice, feedback, consulting. There are churches out there that are thinking, hey, we need to be more creative. Senior leadership's not feeling this. Senior leadership's not seeing this. Our pastor, there is no way he's going to get on a wakeboard and preach a sermon while the boat's going 20 miles an hour. Yeah. Like, where is it? How do I get started? What are some basic steps? How do I kind of break the mold while still working with leadership and feeling, while respecting them and their approach? So give some advices for somebody that kind of wants to take some next steps. How can they get started on this road?
Yeah, I mean, all mine are they're pretty vague. It's not like you need to buy this camera, although, we have some nice cameras. I think it's all about the mindset, right? Because if you have the right mindset, then you'll figure out the how, right? So, I think it starts, like I was saying, with target and objective. Like, who's your audience? And what's your objective? What are you trying to do? And I think people just aren't honest enough about it. I mean, a random church that's like, we're just here to minister to people and do that. Okay, cool. Now get more specific with it. Challenge yourself. What's the specific change and what type of person, So for us, it's like, we call it like we have kind of a persona named Wayne, who's a young, starting his career seeker, which means he's open to spiritual stuff. He's not necessarily part of the church or has church history, but more likely than not, he does. And this is all based on research that we did. And so you don't always have to do that, but just get a clear idea of who it is you're going for and build some real empathy for them, and then suddenly you might get some insight on like, oh, you know what? The thing I just did is super boring to the person I'm trying to reach. or it's offensive to them, or whatever. Like, I mean, I think it's really brutal honesty. It's really worth knowing that people aren't nearly as interested in what you're making as you are, you know?
Mm.
And if you start with that assumption, then you'll work harder to make what you're doing really good, because they don't care if you're at church or some other thing. They're comparing you with whatever else is in their life, you know? And you have to work as hard as you can and rely on God's grace and mercy to approach that in a way that, like, your work isn't so bad it's distracting. So, like, having just that brutal honesty, I just having been around churches a lot, I would say I've just seen way too many churches really proud of themselves versus saying, are we really reaching people? You know, and I think it's true humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. You know, you're thinking about that person that you're trying to reach. And then it comes down to, like, well, what do you uniquely have? You know, you might, you're into collecting, I don't know, like old G.I. Joes or something like that. Well, maybe that's not wakeboarding, but that's what you honestly have. And if you can honestly be yourself and be excited about it, then sure, somebody's going to find something interesting in that. There's always a way to, like, people are just interested in passionate people, you know? And I don't know. Anyway, I'd say, like, find the unique thing. Don't try and copycat another person that inspires you, but just because what they're doing is they're finding their voice. And how do you find your voice and also connect your voice to what that your target is going after? Everything else starts to fall into place, I think.
Did you say earlier, like, one of the first creative services that you guys had did online was like an Easter service or was that?
It was
like
Easter.
Kind of, even just wrapping up, like, what did that first service look like? What were some elements that you did that were digital only versus stage or kind of?
Well, it wasn't even digital. It was just video. So it was still made for live experience, but it was incorporating video, and then it kind of grew because we had a handful of sites at the time. And so it was like, how can we scale the preaching? So it's digital, but live, right? And so it was an Easter service. So rather than it just being like 3 songs and then announcements and then a message, it was a whole experience that we tied together. And so there was, a song up front that was moody and had some, LED background kind of stuff or whatever. And then Brian came up and taught from one of his kind of metaphor locations. And then we'd move back and forth through it. And so it was kind of like teaching 5 minutes of teaching song, 5 minutes teaching song. And then I think we did a whole, like, this, like, long scripture reading of the Easter story with all these kind of rhythmic, like the horse, on Palm Sunday, the horse coming in and you can hear the stuff going, but it's all like, it's more like Stomp than like a Warner Brothers cartoon, but it's more like this rhythmic thing that all builds this beautiful, like, song base and then gets to, like, were you there when they crucified my Lord? And it's just this beautiful emotional retelling of it. And then Brian comes back. And so there are all these cool creative elements to it that were meant to be like, okay, this is the person in the seat who we know is probably here for the one time this year. And how can we get them to, like, experience it when they just think Easter is like, it just kind of goes right past them. So, I don't know. It's probably 4 teaching segments of 5 minutes each, and then a whole bunch of songs, and I don't know, probably communion at the end. I don't know. It's a long time ago.
But, even something like taking one of those services and doing something creative with it, just a small step even to do it, on a weekend. In one of my churches that I've worked with in my life, that was, we did a similar thing where it was 3 7-minute sermons. And we just, hey, one Sunday we're going to experiment.
Yeah,
it could be awesome. It could be a flop, but we're going to give it a shot. We're going to see what would happen.
I think that's right. The super practical thing is, even if you can't make your whole experience for this new digital target kind of person that you're trying to reach, make one segment for them and then test it and be really real with yourself and say, and, seek feedback and say, did it work? And do little bits at a time. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm watching, service number 3 that's rolled on my screen while this is going in the background. I'm now watching, I just blanked on the last name, but you're the female communicator, Allie.
Patterson.
Yeah, so Patterson, she's literally preaching in a graveyard. Like, I'm
that's right.
like tombstone markers in the background. Yeah. And I can guarantee you, like, that imagery carries more power than Ali being on stage with that. So this is just beautiful. I love the creativity of what you're doing, the thinking outside the box. Churches, check out some of their services at Crossroads. It's never a comparison. It's not carbon copy, clone exactly what they're doing, but start to figure out the parts that can work for you, and experiment for all that's good in the world. Experiment, because what we used to know, thank you COVID, we no longer know. So we need to learn more to be more effective in the days to come. And I guarantee no playbook written pre-2020 can be effective for where we are now. And so with this experiment, with learning lessons from one another, this is where we can start to be more effective in the days to come. So, hey, I want to thank you very much for the time. This has been golden. Hey, Ray, just as we're landing the plane, any closing thoughts on your end?
Absolutely, Craig. As I was digesting everything you were saying, because there's just so many things to unearth there, so many things that I'm going to go back and reevaluate some of the stuff that we're doing and asking, are we really considering the person that's receiving this, like the one audience member? Because I think so much of it, what you were talking about, comes down to that in terms of what you're coming into play with. And I wish even more churches and more pastors in particular, as they're preparing their messages, thought about that one person before they opened up the creative stuff, before they thought about some of the other things they were going to do, because that right there might unearth and unlock and maybe even unhinge us from some of our past traditions and have us start thinking about, okay, but what's really going to reach this person? And thinking through how we can focus on that one person who's coming in for the first time, because that's going to change so much of what we do. And then on top of that, if we can educate our regular comers, hey, look, we understand that you're here, but the person that we're thinking about is that friend that you're bringing with you who doesn't know Jesus. Mm-hmm. This way, some of the creative elements don't offend them. They encourage them, and they're even more encouraged to bring their friend to come to know Jesus because of it.
Amen. Love that. Using this creativity to create that shareable resource that connect people with their ones. Definitely love kind of that path and that idea. We talk a lot about that here. Hey, Craig, as we're landing the plane, man, this has been awesome. But any closing thoughts?
Here's what I would say to anybody that's listening to this. My hope is that you take something away here that encourages you. Maybe it challenges you, but that ultimately you come away with more ideas, and you don't come away with, I don't know. It's easy for us to compare. I say that as a creative person who, like, artists are the most arrogant, insecure people that I've ever met, and it's because we're always comparing ourselves. Do I measure up? So my hope and my prayer for everybody who's listening to this is that they feel that there's some bit of inspiration that's coming out of this. And I would say that that's God speaking to you, because he's given you a unique voice to speak to the unique people that he's given you to minister to. And you got to run that down and find out what is your version of ministry. And hopefully some of this is helpful and practical for people, but we're all assigned to reach somebody that nobody else is assigned to. You know what I mean? And so it's, we do our best, and God will be there, and he'll fill in all those gaps, because at least that's what he's done with me so far.
Andy Mage has been on the podcast, I think last week, but and he rewrote a blog in the middle of COVID season for us over at theChurch.digital. Comparison is the thief of joy. And so often as creatives, as people who exude our gifts spiritually, it's very easy to get discouraged when you look at what somebody else is doing. I mean, even as a pastor, it's troublesome sometimes that church is bigger than mine, and so it's more successful. And there are lessons that we all can learn, a small church from a big church, and probably a big church to a small church. There are lessons. Maybe there's opportunities to improve in some area, but it's never about the comparison of it. There's lots of things that are exciting, even from the outside, that I can see from Crossroads. But as good as your services are, honestly, I'm more excited about the lessons to learn from the guides than even the creative aspects of it. And so it's taking these lessons and applying it to our churches that can help us improve, not to try to keep up with the Joneses, but to be more effective to reach the ones. These are all just tools to the end of that disciple making, of that evangelism, so that we can be more effective at a church to create those disciple makers who can go and reach others. And so, Craig, very much thank you for jumping on this conversation on this podcast.
Absolutely. This has
been great. Love the time, and we're going to wrap. For Ray, for Craig, this is Jeff with the Church Digital. Thanks for joining us here today. We'll see you next time here on the pod. Y'all have a good day.